Welcome back to Listen Up Podcast at Grace Christian University, where we take deep dives into student lives. Welcome back to the Listen Up Podcast here at Grace Christian University. We have some announcements for you today. On Tuesdays, we have the Disc Golf Club meeting weekly, and that'll be outside in the ravine. On Wednesday, we have our first tailgate for volleyball, and that will be in the gym at 3:30. We have dorm checks on Thursday, and we also have the art prize scavenger hunt this Friday at 6 to 8:30. And some information about that is signups will be pulled at dinner on Thursday. They're also out in the Kahawa, and there'll be 2 teams will win individual prizes. Signups will be 3 to 4 people to make a team. You may sign up individually and organize teams that way. SAC will also provide $10 for parking, and we will meet in the Commons at 6:30 on Friday for information, packets, and parking money. Requirements to meet back in the Commons at 8:30 to find out who the winners are. And then there'll be an information reminder email that will be sent out on Friday at noon for all the participants. This week we have Dr. Christopher Yuan speaking on Wednesday and Thursday. They will be hour-long meetings, but your teachers and advisors all know of this, so don't worry about going there late. There will be one also at 7 to 8:30. That will be a question and answer. So if you want to go to that, you are absolutely welcome to. And there will also be a lunch hour question and answer with students on Thursday. Those chapels will be surrounding the topic of sexuality, so we'd love to see you there. This week will be off the heezy, as Ethan would say. We're going to keep that tradition alive. All right. So this week we have our first female. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Isabella Rupp, and I'm a freshman here at Grace.
Alrighty. So we'd just like to get to know you a bit. So what's going on in your life at the moment?
Just doing school, meeting new friends, that kind of thing. Pretty plain and basic, but...
Nice. What are you studying?
So my current major is secondary education with a specialty in English.
What made you choose that degree?
I've really enjoyed English a lot just throughout high school. I'm very much a language person in learning Spanish as well as sharpening my English skills. I was really inspired by my high school English teacher who really instilled in me a love for learning English, and I just love how you can convey so many different ideas within one language and be able to share them with other people and relate to people in that way.
Yeah, that's awesome. How did you find out about Grace?
It's kind of funny. I just did a basic Google search for like Christian schools in my area, and Grace popped up, and it was fairly comparable in size to the high school I went to. And I knew that was something that I wanted, so it's kind of how it came about.
Cool. Where did you grow up?
I grew up, well, in a lot of places, but the place I consider my home to be would be in Marcellus, Michigan. It's about an hour and 10 minutes south of here.
Okay. So you said that you've kind of been around. Where the other places that you call home?
Yeah, so I was born here in Grand Rapids,
Okay.
and then I lived in Quincy, Michigan for about first 11 years of my life, and then I lived in Schoolcraft, Michigan for a year, and then I moved to Marcellus when I was 12 or 13.
Wow. All right. So growing up, like, what was your childhood like?
Oh boy.
The can of worms.
Yeah. So I have a twin sister, and my twin sister and I did not really have a great childhood. Both of our parents were alcoholics, and that's how they met. They met in rehab, basically. And our mom was 41 when she had Zoe and I, and she was told she wouldn't be able to have children, but apparently that wasn't true. And so it wasn't a great situation, and my parents just kind of stayed together to raise us. And it was one of those things where we were very, very poor, and it was really hard at points. We relied on government assistance a lot growing up, and it was definitely a struggle. I found out later that we actually had a lot of people from our family and from our community really helping us financially, just putting food on our table or keeping our heat on in the winter. But yeah, it was a major struggle. Our dad passed away when we were 7, and he was the only one in our family that worked. So that put a big strain on things. And and our mom, we got taken from her when we were 11, I believe. We were 10 or 11, because she had a lot of mental health issues too, and she just couldn't take care of us the way that we needed to be taken care of, and it was not a good situation at all. So we lived with our grandparents. They lived in the same town as we did. We lived with our grandparents for a couple months to finish out school, to finish fifth grade. And then we moved in with an aunt and uncle in Schoolcraft, and we lived with them for a year, and that was craziness. And then we moved in with our other aunt and uncle after spending a year in Schoolcraft, and that's where we live now. So that's where we lived for the last 6 years.
Jeez, oh Pete. It's quite a lot.
Yeah, it was.
What were your high school years like?
I loved high school.
Really?
I loved it so much. By the time we graduated, there was 12 other kids in my graduating class, and my twin sister was one of them. And there were 5 of us girls, and the rest of them were boys. So that caused some interesting times.
I bet.
But pretty much, we had a couple people kind of come in and out of our class, but it was pretty much mostly all of the same people throughout high school. And it was just so much fun. We would always go and watch each other play sports, and our boys' sports programs were really good. And so I watched my male classmates, some of them get 6 or 7 district medals within their high school career in a couple different sports. And it was fun. Just it's like a big family. And there was so many cool things that I got to experience with them.
Yeah,
it was just such a blessing.
I'm looking back on those experiences. Where did you see God in the midst of it?
I saw God mostly, I mean, I see him a lot now from when I look back on things. There's no way I ever would have imagined I would be here where I am. But I could all see that he was all, like, the whole time he was leading me to be where I am now. And eventually when I was 12, when I got saved, when I became a Christian, he was leading me in that way the whole time. And I can see that evidence that he was making a way even through, like, the really hard things that I went through.
So you said you were saved at around 11 or 12?
Yeah.
What was that like?
It was one of those things where I was really confused about God. I didn't know a whole lot. Our biological father was a Christian, and we're not sure if our mom was or not, and she passed away when we were 12, like a couple months after I became a Christian. But I remember going to church as a child with our biological dad, but I don't remember a whole lot. And so I just remember the first time I ever remember hearing the gospel was outside of the Catholic Church, outside of my year being in that. And I just, it's so crazy to me that that's just something that was never brought up or I never heard. And so we ended up going to a backyard club, my sister and I, that some missionaries were hosting in the backyard of a family that went to the church that we started going to with our aunt and uncle, the Christian church that we went to. And I think they kind of said that we were just going to be there and, like, help with some of the little kids, but I think there was maybe a hidden agenda in that. Not mad about it, but yeah. And basically how it happened is that is in the middle of July. I was 12. And the missionary basically shared the gospel, and he said, "Does anyone want to know more?" And I just remember being so intrigued because growing up with our parents, I never really knew what trustworthy people were like. And I was like, man, like, this Jesus guy claims to be trustworthy and that he'll never leave you and never fail you. And that's something I had never experienced in either of my parents or really in anybody. I felt like I had never met anyone that I feel like I could depend on. And so I was like, man, I got to figure this out. And I got to see, does God actually keep his promise in that? So that was kind of like the whole motivation behind it, I guess. And then that day I ended up getting saved. And it was something that it's hard for me to describe because I remember right after it, I felt like this warm, fuzzy feeling just covering me. And it was one of the sweetest memories that I have. And I got in the car that day and I told my aunt what had happened, and she just started crying. And I had no idea why. I didn't really see it as, like, I didn't know how big of a deal it was at that time. And she was just crying and crying and crying. And I was like, I was concerned. I was like, did I do something wrong? Like, why is she crying? But she shared with me later as I grew up that her only expectation, well, not her only one, but her main expectation for my sister and I is that we would both come to accept Christ as our Savior. And we had been living with them for a month and a half when that happened. So we kind of blew them out of the water, blew that expectation completely out of the water. So.
Wow. That's amazing. I guess now that you are older and like matured in your faith, what are some moments that like just are really eye-opening to you in your relationship with the Lord?
I mean, there's a couple. Probably the biggest thing for me is I remember, I think it was the summer before my freshman year of high school. My sister and I, for a year or two, had been going to the summer camp by where we live, and my grandfather actually started it. So it's super special place to me. And I never really went through, I think it mostly because I didn't really grow up in the church as a kid. I never really went through that phase of like having to make my faith my own. Like I never relied like or felt like I relied on my parents' faith to like sustain me, I guess. I think it's partly because I was just older when I accepted the Lord, but I just that year at summer camp, I'd gone through some things during my 8th grade year that I wasn't proud of, and I just really I feel like that's when I grew a lot spiritually was that week at camp that year. And when I realized that like God like can take our burdens from us and like we don't have to live with like shame and guilt and regret because like by him dying on the cross like he took those on himself for us, and that like really became real to me. Also in probably my junior year, I started really feeling God's calling in different ways. My sister and I ended up leading a Bible study at our high school for girls, and we did that our junior and senior year. And it was one of the first times where I'd actually like it was one of those things. It was like almost a thought that just popped in my head, like, "Wow, you should lead this Bible study." And it was one of the times where I really felt God's calling, and then like coming to Grace too. And then as I went on a missions trip to Spain last summer, like really just intense feeling of just calling and purpose. That was pretty cool.
Wow. What did you do on your trip to Spain?
So we went with one of my classmates' families. He grew up in Spain as a missionary kid, and they kind of came back and forth between Spain and where we live. And so he was kind of in and out of our class throughout the years. And it was really a God thing, I feel like, because after everything with COVID fell apart and a missions trip to Mexico that was canceled my junior year because of COVID, I was just really disappointed and things like that. But we had started going to their church's youth group about, I think, summer of 2020. And then earlier this year, my friend Josiah, his dad, came up to us and said, "How would you guys feel about ever going to Spain with us sometime?" And I was kind of like, "Oh, yeah, that's cool," stuff like that. And I never really thought much about it. And then Zoe like came to me like a week later and was like, "I think we should go to Spain." And I was just like, that's so far out of my comfort zone. Like, I don't know, like it's super far away, thousands and thousands of miles. I just don't really know how I feel about that. And she said, "We'll pray about it and see what happens." And I was like, okay, well, and I didn't really take it seriously because I was like, yeah, that's like a cool dream, but like it's probably not going to happen.
Yeah.
And then we talked about it later and we both felt a calling to go. And it was like, that's super uncomfortable. Like, and it was the trip at that point was going to be 3 weeks.
Wow.
And so I'm like, that's a lot of time and stuff like that. And I was nervous too because my sister and I mostly only work in the summer, and that's like when we work and we get the money that we need for saving and other things for our expenses throughout the year. And going on that Spain trip would have cut into our work season because we do agricultural work, and so it was really scary because I'm like, well, if I go to Spain, even if I'm doing the Lord's will, like how is that going to accommodate for the loss in income? And then as God would have it, we ended up through a grad party and other avenues, we ended up making like almost to the penny of the amount we would have made in the summer. And that's like when I felt God just say go. And this was like a month and a half before we left to go to Spain. But we went, and I was really scared going because obviously I'm not a fluent Spanish speaker. My friends are, which was very helpful. But when we got there, the trip actually ended up being 28 days because of how flights worked out. So it was longer than we expected. But we ended up, the first week we were there, we went to Word of Life camp in Spain, which was a whole interesting experience because I was not always able to understand people. And it was kind of a struggle at points. But there were some people that we met there that spoke English, and I knew enough Spanish to get around at points. If they didn't laugh at me, which happened, it happened a lot, but I kind of dealt with it. And then once we got back from camp, Josiah's parents were there because they didn't fly with us because they did not get their passports back in time. So there's 4 of us kids that flew over by ourselves, which was kind of fun. But by the time we got back from camp, we started doing helping out with some things at a church that they had planted a very long time ago, helping out doing activities and things like that, planning sports tournaments. We helped at a food pantry type place. We helped there in doing some distribution and that kind of stuff, but a lot of work with the church, a lot of work with youth in the area, because it is just so unreached, and I don't think a lot of people realize that. There was a point in which we were overlooking, maybe half a dozen to a dozen towns of, 9 to 15,000 people each. And as my friend Josiah's dad was pointing out these towns, he said there's no Christian church in that town. And it's like the town that I live in, there's like 7 or 8,000 people. And I think he told me there's somewhere around like a dozen Christian churches. And to think, because it's not like Spain is super, underprivileged or anything like that. Like they're very exposed to the rest of the world. And so to think that there's like no Christian churches there, like I never realized the need, I guess. So that was eye-opening to me, is we can get so caught up in our own little bubbles sometimes that we fail to realize the need that other countries have and other people have. And it was definitely a very humbling experience too, because we saw through the food distribution site and other places, we saw some people that really needed a lot of help, and just different things culturally having to overcome in order to share the gospel, like kind of social walls or ideas that you have to break down first before being able to do that. So it was just a very eye-opening experience, and it was hard to leave.
That's awesome. Who is someone that has made a big impact in your life?
Oh, there's a lot of people. Trying to think of one specific person. I mean, obviously, my aunt and uncle that we live with now made a big difference. They ended up legally adopting us. It was one of those things where a really bad situation turned really good. We found out our mom had passed away in November, and we had been living with our aunt and uncle since June of that same year. And so we found out our mom had passed away, and it was sad, but there was such a estranged relationship with her that it was sad, but we kind of saw it coming. And also she caused a fair amount of problems and things, and just stirred the pot a lot. So it was easier to be able to move forward. And when we found out that she'd passed away and our aunt told us, one of the first questions that I can't remember whether it was Zoe or I asked, but we said, does that mean you guys can adopt us now? And that was not something we'd ever talked about. And my aunt was kind of stunned. She's like, you guys want us to do that? And we said, yeah, we want you guys to do that. And because we knew that this, they had told us, they're like, you guys aren't going anywhere. You're done moving around. And so we started that adoption process, and they were just, they didn't have to. They had already raised a total number of 5 kids. Wow. And they thought that they were empty nesters for good. But then God led them into bringing Zoe and I into their home. And, in a time when a lot of people would, think about being empty nesters and settling into that, they were suddenly raising 2 12-year-olds who needed a lot of help and a lot of attention and needed to know how to cope with things that had happened. So they're definitely pretty high on that list. And I'm just really forever grateful for them. They're my number one fans.
Oh, that's so cool. Alrighty. We have a truth bomb.
Oh boy.
So what's a piece of advice or encouragement that you'd like to share with the students?
That's a good question. I was kind of thinking about this. Something that God has really taught me, I think in the last year or so, maybe 2 years, especially with COVID, one of them being that you can't, I think about the story in the Bible when the Israelites are going through the wilderness and they start, they complain a lot.
Yes,
and they said at one point, they're like, man, we just want to go back to Egypt. And everyone's like, why in the world would you want to go back to Egypt? And, they were enslaved and things weren't great. And they said, well, because, at least there we had security of having food and stuff like that. And one of the biggest things I always think about is, we can look at that story and say, why would you want to go back to a place where you were enslaved when if you just keep going, God has something better promised for you? And they knew that. But yet they're like, it's really hard now and we don't want to go through the pain, even if what's before them was better. And I think we can look at stories, especially about the Israelites and other people in the Bible, and say, man, those people are so dumb. Like, what's going on here? And then we can look at our own lives and say, but what's our Egypt? What has God set us free from that we say, it's more comfortable than what I'm walking through right now? So let's just go back to that. And instead of walking through it knowing God's using your situation to better you and for good, we constantly go back to that Egypt all the time. And that's something that God has like really shown me, that it's he didn't design us to go back to something he set us free from. There's freedom for it or from it for a reason. And even if you don't see it, like, you have to understand that God's working things out for your good. Something else too with COVID that God really taught me and my sister both was that, like, we don't always take like God's or what you feel like God's answer to a prayer is as a no. If it doesn't happen right in that instance, it might be a wait. We experienced that with a missions trip to Mexico that we had been looking forward to for 5 or 6 years. And then our junior year, COVID happened like very quickly. And we were supposed to leave like a week or two after COVID happened. And that obviously didn't happen. And it kept getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. We thought, okay, we'll just go our senior year. And then it got canceled again because of COVID. And it was one of those things where at the time, like, that was the thing about quarantine and things that absolutely like destroyed me. But and really affected me a lot, was looking forward to something for so long and just having it literally just fall through my hands. But as the Lord would have it, he used that situation to, I think, grow our team too. There came a point where our Spanish teacher who was leading the trip pulled 6 of us seniors into his classroom our senior year and said, I know that it's not going to happen in March like it should, but he said, if I was able to do it, would you guys want to go still? Would there still be interest? And he said, I would want to do it in the summer after graduation. And he said, but have low expectations, because as we know, things don't always turn out the way that we think that they will. And so but all 6 of us said, yeah, we're very interested. And God just worked in miraculous ways, like he always seems to. And we ended up going in June, like pretty soon after graduation. And it was so amazing because it was something that, even longer than looking up to the older kids and, not being able to wait until we were old enough to go. And then like finally going, it was just one of those things where I realized God wasn't saying no, he was saying wait. And so I think oftentimes we can say God answers prayers in yeses or nos, but I think sometimes maybe it is a no sometimes, or it's wait, I have something better. So that like that whole situation really changed my perspective on what God says when you pray things. And also learning to pray intentionally is something too. Like, I was one of those people who, growing up in Christian school, we prayed a lot, out loud and with other people. And it was, let's say what you think other people want you to say when you pray, or what you think you should say. But it came to a point with me, and my sister and I have both talked about this with each other, that God like wants to hear your heart. He already knows what's going on, and he just wants you to come to him and tell him how you feel about something, or if something's bothering you or burdening you, and you can be honest with him and talk to him like a friend. And that really changed how I prayed a lot, and it was very helpful through everything that went on with COVID and all those disappointments.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Alrighty, that concludes our podcast for the day. Thank you so much for being a guest. And we'll see you next week. And as always, listen up.
Thank you for listening. If you would like to be a part of our live audience, recordings take place Mondays at 1:30 p.m. in the Quiet Room. If you would like to be a guest on our show, send us an email at listenup@gracechristian.edu. See you next week on the Listen Up podcast.